Welcome to Building Your Best Brain podcast. My name's Sylvie. I am finishing my PhD in neuroscience, yoga teacher, meditation teacher, also someone that has experienced many different variations of mental health problems, if you'd like to call it that. And I introduce myself like that because today I'm sharing you everything I wish literally everyone would know when it comes to chronic stress. And so today we'll dive into a little bit about chronic stress at the level of the brain and the body, so what physiologically happens. And the whole objective to sharing this information is so that you can then apply it to your everyday life. Because a big thing that I see with the people that I teach, but also the people that I love, is that we don't fully understand what chronic stress is. We don't always know the signs of it. So I have people that come up to me with different bodily signs and they're not sure what the source is. And usually the source is chronic stress. And then it's hard to know how to fix it, or even having the right perspective and expectations around fixing it, in particular when it comes to timeline. We're in the age of fixing everything quickly, and it's not right. It's just the body, the brain, it doesn't work like that. What works like that is other forces, other things. But my hope for this episode is that you can walk away with some information that you can apply directly. So you can begin to identify how chronic stress might be showing up in your body and how to shift out of it in a way that's going to be effective for you. So the first thing I want to start with is, what is a stressor? Simply put, it's something that we perceive as a threat. And a threat ultimately to our survival. Keyword being perceived. It's not actually always a threat for our survival, but it's a perceived threat for our survival. And there's a lot of things that people don't realize are stressors, but actually are. So we have internal stressors, and I like to characterize that as things happening inside of the body and the mind. So for example, when you're sick, like let's say you're fighting off a bug of some sort, that is a stressor for your body. So you may notice, for example, when you're sick, you're not able to deal with external stressors as well, partially because you're dealing with an internal stressor. And things like your thoughts, for example. So the internal scripts that we play in our head, or even past memories or old fears, can still be perceived as a threat in your brain and can turn on the stress response. And we have our external stressors as well, right? So big life events, be it work-related, family-related, moving, traumatic events, right? Like divorce, childhood trauma, those kinds of things are also stressors. And then other external things can be things like temperature, right? Weather, kind of other physical things that may be impeding our ability to stay in a rest and digest state, which is our parasympathetic state. And what happens with these stressors is that it turns on has the potential of turning on two different modes in our brain. So I mentioned, right, we have our parasympathetic response, our rest and digest, and we have our sympathetic response, fight or flight. The fight or flight comes in two different flavors. We have our fast response and our slow response, which I won't go into great detail, but I do have an episode which I will link in the show notes. But basically, the fast response will release noradrenaline or norepinephrine as a cue to act on the body, which we'll describe together. And then the slow response releases cortisol, which also acts like a cue and has different receptors in the body. Now, something that I want to start this episode with before we go any further is that our perception has a big role when it comes to stress in general. So there's been a study, which I will link, that looked at different groups of people, their level of stress, as well as how they perceived their stress, if they perceived their stress as being detrimental to their health. And what they found was that those that did the worst in terms of health outcomes were not the people that had low levels of stress. They were not the people that had high levels of stress, but did not perceive stress as impacting their health. It was those that had high levels of stress and saw that stress impacted their health. And you're like, okay, well, then why are we doing this episode at all? If, this perception, like, aren't you just feeding the perception that is bad for your health? What I'm sharing with you today is a way to look at your stress as a tool for healing and changing your perception around it and your expectations around it so that when you're healing it, you're not getting into a place of more stress. I find that when we add urgency onto anything, that it will shift us to a fight or flight response, because in a way we are perceiving it as a threat. We don't have it all figured out right now. We don't have it regulated right now, which means that I'm in danger. And once you realize how the process works and how you can track the process and see it working, that urgency will decrease and your results, your ability to shift through things will automatically be that much faster. So before we go any further into the science around this, know that your perception has a big part of it, and even working on your perception alone, seeing your stress as a tool for healing, a way that it's communicating with you, will help tenfold. And so the stress response is inherently an adaptive response. It allows us to respond to stressors, which again we perceive as threats, in a way that's advantageous. And our bodies were designed that way to keep us alive, to keep the species, which is humans, Homo sapiens, forward. And where it can begin to become maladaptive is when the stressor is chronic. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today. What are the changes that happens when we have chronic stress? And so I hope you can appreciate that, when you look at your day and you can identify some of the stressors, right? If they're happening over and over again, our body will begin to adapt on the inside to be able to manage that level of noradrenaline or cortisol that is constantly being pumped through your body. There are some people that'll have naturally high levels of this or low levels of this, usually are related to their adrenals, which is the gland on top of the kidneys that produces these hormones, neurotransmitters. But for the most part, those conditions are really rare. Those will be depleted or changed based off of how we're managing stressors chronically. And it's adaptive in the sense that based off of the nerves that innervate different organs and muscles, as well as the receptors that are expressed in different muscles and organs, basically get us into a place where we're able to address that stressor acutely, which means right in the moment. And so where we'll start is describing a little bit about the receptors and where they're located, and then what your brain tries to get your body to do in an acute stress situation. And then we'll bring in the chronic piece. But these hormones, right, noradrenaline, cortisol, that are expressed in the adrenals, the only way that they work is through proteins called receptors. And you have even in the brain, right, with neurotransmitters, you have many different receptors that can bind to one single neurotransmitter. And they all have slightly different unique functions, which makes everything a bit complicated, but also a lot of fun. But in short, you have your hormone, let's say cortisol, and it'll bind to this protein called a receptor, and it'll basically kind of catch it. And once they make this connection, the receptor protein will change in different ways to allow that cell to respond or behave differently. Norepinephrine or noradrenaline has a lot of receptors in the heart and the lungs. It also has quite a few receptors in the brain, in areas particularly in the back, so your brainstem, which is a lot of your lizard brain functions, right? So those are your unconscious autonomic must-have functions, as well as other places in the brain. And when it comes to cortisol, their receptors are also in the heart. They're also found in the kidney and in the colon. They're found in your muscles, heart, and even in your sweat glands. And cortisol also has a lot of different receptors in the brain. In particular, the hippocampus, for example, which is involved in learning and memory. So the part of the reason why there are these receptors in the brain is to help inhibit the stress response. So once your body reaches a certain level, it'll begin to inhibit it, and that's a way for it not to go on for so long. But if we're presented stressors chronically, that gets thrown out the window. And so when we look at the things that the body does to get ready to handle a stressor, you heard a lot when it comes to the heart, and there's a few reasons why this is the case. One is that we want our blood pumping to be able to kind of run, essentially, right, and freeze, for example. So movement, right, we want the blood going to our muscles so that we're able to react and address what we need to address. We also, in that case, need the blood pumping more. And we also need a release of oxygen and an increase of oxygen to release glucose, which is the energy source that we have in our muscles, so that they're able to contract and elongate and do whatever they need to do to be able to handle the stressor. And so that changes a lot of things, right? That changes your heart rate, that changes your breathing rate, that changes how warm your body feels, that changes your sweat. And you even hear a lot, and it's scientifically true, right, that when you're stressed and you're sweating, it smells different. That is thanks to our buddy cortisol. And our breathing rate will change to meet the energetic demands that our body has. And this is true whether the stressor is running away from a bear, whether the stressor is answering 100 emails in your inbox, like people have kind of sweaty palms or sweat during a presentation they're particularly nervous about. This is how our body is designed to meet what we have these perceived stressors for. And as much as we have things that turn on, we also have things that turn off. For example, we don't prioritize digestion when we're in this phase, right? So shuttling nutrients, processing food, having, good, easy bowel movements, all of that gets out the window. We're not prioritizing reproduction, right? So having sex, being aroused to have sex is not something that the body does easily when these hormones are circulating. And we also aren't primed to deal with, we're not primed to deal with external pathogens. So if we get sick, it's interesting. There's this interesting relationship where usually your immune system gets repressed, especially in the beginning. And it is an advantageous thing. Like, you're not reacting to things like you would if you were normal and healthy. But if you prolong that for too long, it's no longer immunoprotective. It's no longer working in your favor. You've actually just depleted the cells and the antigens that you need to be able to fight off things. So that's why people that are chronically stressed are often sick more than people that are not. And so when you have these hormones circulating for a long time, right, you're dealing with stressor after stressor, these levels are rising, the body and the brain kind of go, okay, well, this is our new normal now. So how are we going to adjust to our new normal. And it'll do that in a few different kind of molecular cellular ways, where it'll either try to produce less cortisol or epinephrine, right? By maybe reducing an enzyme or something of that nature. It could also change the level of receptors you have, right? So we call this the expression. So maybe they'll put in more receptors because it's kind of like, hey, well, we have more of these hormones, so let's like get them binding and doing what they're doing. And it could even change the sensitivity, right? So you could have an increased sensitivity, but usually what happens over a long period of time is you have a decrease in sensitivity, a desensitization. And where this can really bite us, myself included, is if your receptors are desensitized to these hormones, it's harder for the entire response to turn down, right? Because like I mentioned a few minutes ago, once you have kind of a certain level of these hormones in your body, they'll bind to receptors in your brain that go, they'll communicate to your adrenals, we don't need this anymore. Let's shut down the production. Let's shift this out. But if they're desensitized or they're being damaged by all of this, then it won't shut down and it'll just keep going. And you get into this feed-forward mechanism. Feed-forward mechanism meaning that you're producing more hormones, that's producing more of a response. And instead of the response saying that's enough, which we call a negative feedback mechanism, it produces more, which is our feed-forward. And this is where it gets really tricky to begin to then figure out, well, how do you begin to address this in a way that is meaningful and can actually shift your brain and body out of it, right? And this is where when you don't change anything in your life and you start using a supplement, or you do really, really hard exercise as a way to release because you feel some endorphins and you feel good for a little bit, and then you come back to your baseline. And this is what chronic stress does, is it creates a new baseline that your entire body is operating at. So it's hard to shift in a meaningful way, and you're being lied to that it's really just like one thing you can take that'll fix it all. It's also a really good example why vacations don't really work. Or even, for example, you take a vacation, you relax, you come back to your life, you really don't feel that different, or you're unable to relax when you're on vacation because your baseline has been shifted. So even and this is the big thing, even with the perceived absence of stressors, you're unable to get into a parasympathetic state. This is likely why your baseline has been shifted at both the level of your body and your brain. And so I promise I'm telling you this for a reason that it is empowering and will help you. Because one, I hope that it provides you a really compassionate place to go off of when you come up against stressors, or you see your stress symptoms, right? For example, increased sweatiness or racing thoughts, stomach problems, always getting sick. And instead of coming from a place of frustration, anger, shame, that you come from a place of love and you see that your body has been adjusting for you. It has made changes so that you've been able to survive in this world. And that there's nothing that you're doing wrong, right? Like, it has nothing to do with motivation. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing to do with work ethic, but that it is biology, and you can turn this to your favor with small repeated actions. And even having that perspective shift alone, where that it's not, because it isn't, it's not your fault. You haven't been taught this. We're living in a world that, really celebrates the chronic stress. and really doesn't celebrate slowing down and doesn't appreciate how the body adjusts when we give chronic stressors. And it's not that, you know, the goal is not to never have a stressor again, but it's be able to have a body and a brain that can move through it quickly, can move through it swiftly, so that you still feel energized at the end of your day. And that you feel like yourself, right? Because when we're chronically stressed, like we don't feel like ourselves, and our body is deviating from our homeostatic status, right? Our normal kind of healthy aligned baseline has literally physically shifted. And so having that perspective shift alone will make a big difference. And the way through it is for a lifestyle shift. And what I mean by that is having a small activity that all its purpose is to regulate your stress response. Small, repeated every day, so that you begin to teach your body that's already at an elevated baseline how to get back into the parasympathetic. And the more you tap into it, intentionally tap into it, you don't even have to feel it right away, but the more you do it, you begin to shift the feedback loop in the other direction. And once you start shifting it in the other direction, it'll also gain momentum, and it won't stop either. And you'll develop a new baseline. And so I'm going to give a few examples of basically entry points into the feedback loop, right? So I hope you can appreciate with what I was saying when it comes to our stress response and how it shows up in the body, where the receptors are. Those are avenues that we consciously as humans can like get in there and change as a way to communicate to our brain that we don't need to be in a sympathetic response anymore. And so I'm going to share a few of my favorites. Yeah. One is exercise, but a particular form of exercise. So things like, because there are some exercises that actually increase your cortisol. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like it's all adaptive, it's all perfect. But if your baseline's already really high, these forms of exercises won't help you create a new baseline. It's just reinforcing the one you already have. So things like lifting really, really heavy weights. So kind of like, you know, like the powerlifting, the explosive stuff, high intensity interval training, HIIT workouts, sprinting, long distance running, that's a lot of impact that your body's enduring. But things like, you know, you can still do weightlifting, but kind of like lower reps, higher reps, lower weight. Cardio is great, but, you know, doing walks, light jogs, slow Stairmaster, especially if you can do those things in nature, you get a nice bilateral movement, which will help synchronize your brain waves. Nature, I mean, there is studies to show this, but I really don't need to link the studies. It's always better to be in nature for our nervous system. And it also shows our brain too that we're able to rest. It's interesting. You know, we are very much in a hustle culture, and we're definitely being reinforced to stay in a hustle culture. And what that does to our brain sometimes, I know it certainly does with me, is that it doesn't feel safe to rest. So if you're doing some of these exercises that are slower moving, slow flow yoga is one of my absolute favorites, and I'll share a link of one that I teach, but there's lots of teachers that do, that it's safe to move at a slower pace. And it may feel a bit funny because we're so used to being at a fast pace, but moving at a slower pace is an amazing thing for your brain to create this new baseline. And you're burning off that excess energy that your stress response is pumping out, even though you're sitting at your desk. So that's a really great one. Exercise, specific types of exercise. 2 is breath work, which I will never, ever, ever, ever stop talking about. And that's because it plays directly with our heart rate as well as our breathing rate. And it communicates directly to our lizard brain. So you don't need to like rationalize or like use any of your frontal lobes to CBT your way out of a stressful situation. Which honestly, when you're in a really stressful situation, often doesn't work. And I'll link more of the science around breath work and stress here as well, but that is another great one that I would try. 3 is meditation. And that's for a little bit around, your brain waves being able to sync up. So, I mean, this is a whole topic on its own where we can dive into the different types of meditation. Some do show to have really great reduction in cortisol and like anti-anxiety effects. So that's also another one that you can implement. And the last one I'll suggest, which you do have to be really particular about this one, is writing. So journaling, so some form of cognitive release. And the reason why I say you have to be a little bit careful with this one, because there's a very fine line between, writing something to get it out of your brain versus writing something so that's actually being reinforced in your brain. And that's really linked to like kind of the emotions you feel. So I don't often journal as a form of stress relief. I will use usually the first 2. I have a consistent meditation practice always, but if I'm in a situation where I feel the stress really acutely, I'll use either the slow walk or the breathwork practice, usually together. But when I am using writing, it's usually to neutralize a thought or a memory, to bring my emotions down so that I have more resources to begin to deal with my stressors in a different way. And so if you want me to dive into the science behind any of those specific tools, drop them in the comments below. I'm happy to have a whole episode dedicated on diving into those in particular. And really what I hope for is that you hold yourself with a lot of compassion as you move through this and you look at it differently and address it differently. And please keep me posted on how this works for you and what you're coming up against. We don't have to do this alone. We don't have to do this alone, and begin to notice the ways that you have really small shifts. That's a huge key in seeing how you're changing. And again, getting into that feed forward in the right direction. Seeing the changing, noticing the changing will help you create that new baseline even faster. I can't wait to hear how it all works for you guys, and I look forward to chatting again with you soon.